Okay, so session 2, we're going to talk about how we got here. So very, very brief history. We've already covered off a lot of the key concepts, so we're going to use that to make back a little bit of time. So we're going to talk about where we are now and what you can do, and then some regulatory and policy developments. So begin with in how we got here. There's going to be quite a lot of handover one to the other. I'm going to cover off how finance ended up tackling the nature topic, and then Inka will talk about Finland, and Malcolm will talk about more broadly where we are in terms of understanding our relationship with nature. So finance, I mean, I like to conceive of it in kind of 3 phases. First of all, in the early noughties, you had a pretty much a reputation-driven agenda when it came to environmental factors. You might remember the Bhopal disaster, the Valdez, Chernobyl, and basically what happened is by we got to the noughties, a lot of stuff that existed in terms of responsible investment was mainly about making sure such controversy risks were hedged out, making sure that there was socially responsible investment when it came to workers' rights. And so there was a lot of bespoke strategies like that existed coming into the noughties, and these were built on. So I've got Jupiter Ecology noted there, that was running some funds. These were then built on in areas such as the Equator Principles. We had the first carbon audit run by what is now Henderson, but a company called Trucost did that back in 2005, and the first green bond in 2007. So even though it was very much still a reputational-driven agenda, broadly speaking, there was a lot of pioneering going on. So yes, CSR and do no harm, but also quite a lot of pioneering that set the stage for what I kind of define as agenda seeking. So then it became a case of how to use those pioneering activities in more the mainstream agenda of financial institutions and in the policy community, which culminated in Paris in 2016. And really, this was about using ESG and then using climate as a way to say you could take a more intelligent approach to finance. It was, again, about intelligence. It was about, ESG hadn't been weaponized or politicized. It was a risk management framework. And equally in 2015, you had Mark Carney's tragedy of the Horizon speech, so the then governor of the Bank of England, and that again showcased how this was becoming much more a mainstream concern of the financial community and of supervisors. So there was agenda seeking, and then we've really moved into agenda setting. So people have signed up to targets. So you've got the GFANZ related commitments, for example. You've got Frank Elderson putting nature on the agenda. So he had he was at the time, I believe, the chair of the ECB. So he had his Natura Finis Magnantra speech and Medusa speech. And again, he's just saying this is a material financial risk to the system, nature loss. And we see that there is now a representative for sustainability factors or for integration in supervisory committees, on boards, and so on and so forth. So it's really now on the agenda and setting the agenda, and now we have the inevitable backlash. So the fact we have a backlash, I think, is representative of how this is now in the mainstream, because now we've got people pushing back against it, because it's become something that really impacts the way they do business. So that's how sustainable finance has evolved, and how nature, particularly nature in particular, has come onto the scene. In Finland, Inka. Yeah.
So as I promised, I'm here to give some Finnish examples to make this as relevant for you as possible. So one of the latest developments in Finnish regulation is the renewed Nature Conservation Act that came into force last year. And one of the big issues there is that it includes now the guidelines for voluntary ecological compensation. Compensation will still be voluntary for all kinds of projects, but if you are going to compensate, then you must follow the guidelines from this act. Of course, once again, mitigation hierarchy must be followed, and this is as Malcolm mentioned, the mitigation hierarchy is now included in many countries' regulation. Now it has also been introduced in Finnish regulation. So first avoid, then reduce, then replace, and finally compensate if nothing else can be done. And the point of introducing these guidelines is to avoid wild compensation that we have seen on the carbon side. So to make sure that if companies are about to compensate in Finland, they follow these guidelines. They actually consist of very detailed technical level instructions for compensating. The company must assess the nature impact and create a compensation plan based on best available scientific data. And the used unit for compensation is nature value hectare, luontoarvo hehtaari in Finnish. One of the first compensation projects are now ongoing. One company doing the compensation is Eurowind Energy, quite a big wind energy company. And they are going to compensate the nature loss of their Tielampi wind farm that will consist of 17 wind turbines. And the compensation will take place through habitat restoration and protection. They have been estimating the nature values, and the compensation area has been found already. And currently the environmental authorities are assessing the plans. And the project is currently in permit process, and the building is expected to start in 2027. And I think we have also Dasos representatives here, so Dasos is very much involved in this project. To you, Malcolm. Thanks.
Thanks, Inka. So I'm going to zoom back out again to the global level and talk through some of the organising concepts that underpin the TNFD and the LEAP framework. So I think many people are quite familiar with the progress of climate negotiations, which started in the late 80s. They've taken a very, very long time. There were lots of different steps on the way, but ending up in the Paris Agreement, where there is a consensus agreement with a measurable global target to in that case to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees and work towards keeping below 1.5 degrees of warming. And along the way, there are that global target, the Paris Agreement for climate, enabled the establishment of organisations like the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, which translate that global agreement into actions for individual companies or financial institutions. And we have had a similar sort of trajectory for biodiversity, but actually the international discussion started at broadly the same time, 1992 Rio Earth Summit, but they've been a lot slower for many reasons. One being it's very complex. Biodiversity is a complex idea. The Global Convention on Biological Diversity includes a lot of different things. A big part of it is around intellectual property rights for biodiversity, and so separating out these different strands of discussion has been really, really challenging. But this has, through a similar sort of process, ended up with the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed by about 196 countries in Montreal a couple of years ago, which does now start to set quantitative objective targets for the global community to work towards for biodiversity. And as with climate, we have the sort of organising idea, concept of net zero, and for biodiversity, the equivalent is nature positive. That term doesn't appear in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but the essence of the idea is there. So we'll sort of dig into that a little bit more about what this term nature positive really means. And why are we focusing on this? Well, first of all, it is part of the organising framework of TNFD. TNFD's mission is to help institutions collect and have the information available to make decisions which move allocation of capital towards investments which encourage a nature positive outcomes. So they use this idea. So conceptually, it's a graph. It's always dangerous to put up a graph, but it's relatively simple. It's that essentially nature is on a declining trajectory right now. And the idea about being nature positive is we don't want to just slow the rate of loss, but we need to bend that curve so that nature can actually recover, so that we end up with more nature in the future than there is now. Obviously, there are very significant local variations. If you take my country, the UK, we're one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. In the Fenlands, which is part of near Cambridge, where we're based, there's less than 0.5% of the original natural habitat of Fenland remaining. Everything else is converted to mostly industrial, intensive agriculture and infrastructure. Heavily nature depleted, so bending the curve there and improving things is going to be a big challenge. Where I used to work, a country called Gabon, more than 80% of the country is still forest. A lot of that is intact. Most of the wildlife is still there. So they are starting at a very different place. So this is a concept that overall encapsulates the level of ambition that's in the global biodiversity framework. And it's a useful concept because we need to. There was one in that first Menti. There was a comment about making sure we keep it real, that we're not doing reporting for reporting's sake. So having this idea in the back of your mind that this is what we're actually trying to achieve as a global community helps really understand whether a given assessment or action is valuable. Essentially, what you can simplify it down very much to do less harm, do more good, and you can think about that, in terms of, if I'm making an investment, is that investment basically continuing business as usual, a negative trend? Is it completely neutral, decoupled from nature? Great. Is it contributing to halting slowing the rate of decline, or is it contributing to the nature recovery? And just thinking around like that can already help a lot of decision making. And that brings us on to the point that assessments, TNFD is designed to be a tool to be useful. It's not disclosure for disclosure's sake. It's disclosure for achieving some specific outcomes and helping ensure the resilience of both the global economy, but also individual organizations and companies within that. So it's really important to think that doing an assessment of interaction with nature can be quite complicated. That's why TNFD has provided the LEAP guidance to help people structure that, and that's why it's useful. But we shouldn't let assessment detract from actions where the actions are already clear and feasible. So a little bit of analysis can get you a long way. For example, it's well known that certain commodities are heavily linked to tropical deforestation, for example. So if your portfolio is heavily exposed to those, well, maybe there are some specific actions you can take right now to reduce those risks without, whilst taking the time to understand a bit further, where exactly is that happening? Where exactly is that? How important is it in total? So there may be some sort of no regrets early actions you can take. And those actions, by, for example, implementing a policy around zero deforestation or zero conversion of natural ecosystems, that may throw up new challenges and enable you to do, direct further analysis. If you find out that, actually, this commodity that I'm exposed to, I'm invested in, maybe it's a mineral, is actually causing significant deforestation because of, or habitat loss because of the way it's mined, then that's something you can dig into in more detail. So the point being, it's analysis for a particular reason, and the idea of nature positive and having that at the back of the mind, enables keeping that focus on what's really important and what's actually going to drive change. I looked through the attendee list. I'm afraid I couldn't read all the different job titles of people here, but I think most people here have a sustainability mandate. And so, as part of that, part of your job is often providing objective information to enable decision making. But part of it is also around being able to convince people. If you do an analysis and just put a report on someone's desk, it might not change the world. But if you can use some of these concepts around nature positive and get that mindset and thinking in the organisation, that can really help carry the message. So that's why we're sort of focusing on that as an organising idea. And of course, exactly how that translates into what you do is going to be very dependent on the type of institution that you're working with and the types of investment that you're making. So I'll hand over to Grant on that.
Am I muted now? There we go, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. So you might have seen on the last slide, one of the ways in which to kind of progress through those levels of analysis would be, well, what data do you have as a financial institution? And I think that's a fair point, and I touched on it earlier. So, knowing where to focus means analyzing data, but data availability differs by asset type or finance type, right? So in the listed markets, you're going to be relying on that publicly available information and maybe on third-party information from data vendors, which often is a manipulation of publicly available information into some sort of a qualitative metric of some kind. So if you've got strategies or investments in the listed space, that's probably what you're going to be relying upon. Whereas on the private side, Malcolm's spoken about even that very first example today with the vultures in Kenya. That was project finance. So, for a long time, you've got a lot of granular data there, a lot of granular site level information to work with. And of course, this does extend to many private asset and real asset categories. So infrastructure funds, real estate funds tend to be today where a lot of that location specific analysis is happening. So listed data, like listed finance data availability is impacted by different factors, but it's very likely to increase. So something that is true that we observe is there's to some extent a waiting for the first round of CSRD reporting happening, because that will be a big treasure trove of information about organizations over a certain size. So as the slide says on the left-hand side, publicly available information is of course influenced by those disclosure requirements. But then also on the third-party side, sometimes it just depends on how much money you have. So, for example, there are many asset-level databases available. So, for example, you could get asset-level information about power generation or about mines, or about where various oil and gas infrastructure is. So again, if you were looking to, deep dive on a specific company and be able to say, well, this is where you can make some material improvements in terms of your nature interface when you're engaging with them or when you're having dialogues with them, there are some data sets that will be available for that. It's just a question of price a lot of the time. In the private space, and I've kind of mentioned a few already, but I think that one of the opportunities/challenges that we have generally to dive down into the bespoke information is around supply chain data. Now, if you're invested in on a private basis, let's say you're the majority owner of somebody that's operating in an agricultural value chain, somewhere a food value chain, or indeed in value chains related to minerals or metals, so sectors that have a very material impact on nature at the beginning of the supply chain, then it is true and possible that those companies that you might be the majority shareholder in, or that you have a sizable stake in, will have information about their sourcing. Yes, it might change over time, but a lot of it might be direct contracts over an extended period, particularly for minerals and for metals. So straight off the bat there, you've got commodity and sourcing information that can be analyzed and that can become quite location explicit quite quickly, and for which there are already other types of evidence and expertise existing about that location's nature significance or that commodity's typical impact profile over its life cycle. So there's a lot of evidence that can already be utilized. Equally, on the trade finance point, it is occasionally true that there are commodity tags with that trade finance. So, without getting into too much detail, but it is true that if it's not on a revolving basis, but it's on an actual contract basis, then you may have that information as a bank on the trade finance side. So this data point is really, really key because it does, to an extent, become an organizing concept for later workshops. But before I move on, I kind of think I want to say that at all levels, as Malcolm emphasized, there is assessment and analysis possible, which can, of course, inform further questions and the right questions to the right companies in the right sectors that basically allows you to prioritize where your scarce time and resources go. Because, as Malcolm said, a lot of sustainability professionals in the room, but a lot of those that I'm sure are doing this as a part of a wider remit too, and so time is scarce, and that can be a challenge. Just to drive the point home, it's quite straightforward to identify high impact sectors. I mean, there's evidence bases behind why these are all the high impact sectors on nature, of course, but I think that most of us in this room could intuit that these are the high impact sectors. And the highest dependency sectors, equally, there's some overlap, of course. And I'm just driving home a point here that, that's already a piece of knowledge. There are already a number of publicly available fact sheets, by the community that the Biodiversity Consultancy and others are a part of, such as from UNEP WCMC, based in Cambridge, and the various fact sheets behind their on-call database that can really help you understand, well, actually, what specifically is the reason why these are the highest impact sectors? Like, what aspects of nature are they impacting? So there's accessible knowledge there to utilize, and but then what to do with them? And again, because of that level of data, it's fair you could take action, but equally the actions will be of varying types. So just to generalize, but to give you some solid kind of grounding and ideas, where we tend to see it on the listed side you'd have collective engagement, with other investors, that certainly happens. But also the opportunity to develop nature-specific products. So that might be supporting with new types of issuance. So over the course of the past few weeks, ICMA has updated the International Capital Markets Authority has updated its guidance on biodiversity-related KPIs. Okay, so there's some innovation on the instrument side for issuances. Of course, you could look at the EU Green Bond Standard and Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. There's guidance there on biodiversity. So all of this can happen in the listed space. And indeed, to issue a green bond today, you need to conform with a do no harm principle when it comes to biodiversity. Some would argue that sets the bar too high, but the point is that there is guidance there, right? And then in the middle of this, to switch to the private side, if you're talking about corporate loan agreements, it can, of course, you could have linked loan agreements. So you've got your linked side. So I've spoken about the debt and the issuances side, but you could have the linked side. Equally, you're a bank that could go through and tag a bunch of lending as nature this or nature that based on expert advice and understanding the interface better. Well, then that maybe be something that you could move off balance sheet. Maybe you could sell that and package that and sell that to an investor via securitization. And this is a sort of innovation that in pockets is happening already, and of course has happened for a while when it came to sustainability linked instruments. I think that we need to remember that nature is not necessarily this is not a new concept. It's just that we got a bit carbon tunnel syndrome for a while, very focused on climate. But if you go back 10, 15 years, we were talking about the environment. We were talking about environmental risk management. We were talking about the E in ESG. And so this is really just about, using the tools and the new policy and regulatory agenda and TNFD to get back to a more kind of appropriate breadth of analysis when it comes to this. So yeah, writing it into various lending agreements, of course, enhanced due diligence, transaction screening transactions and investments. And of course, then maybe driving change at the board level, putting certain KPIs, certain targets on the board level, which brings me to the middle part, that certainly setting targets and exclusions is a way that, you know, intelligence based on this data analysis could go. I don't think that I think we're 2 to 3 years off major financial institutions setting big banner targets that they will be held to, but that's certainly the direction of travel, and there are experimentations going on with regards to what targets are viable. We've heard about the mitigation hierarchy a couple of times, but we haven't spoken about it explicitly yet. So I'm going to hand back to Malcolm to do that.
Thanks, Grant.
Yeah.
So, so I think that, you know, the key point of what we're trying to get across here is that it's not assessment for assessment's sake through a TNFD LEAP approach. It's assessment for a particular set of outcomes. So Grant's provided some examples of the types of action that this might lead to. And so knowing what type of action you might want to lead to lets you calibrate the level of the assessment that you might need. And then in terms of, you know, communicating and planning you know, those targets that Grant talked about, there are, you know, your organising frameworks that can really be helpful with that, and having those in the back of your mind as you go into an assessment is really helpful. So the mitigation hierarchy is exactly that, an organising framework for biodiversity mitigation. Essentially, it's in two halves, so it relates to that idea of nature positive and bending the curve. You have, on the one hand, in green there, the preventive actions, so ideally avoiding an impact entirely in the first place, and if not, minimizing it. So we could take an example, for example, with a mining company. Sometimes you have the pit where you want to dig out the ore, and in some cases you can change the way you mine and the way to enter it. In other places it's really hard. So that often is not an easy impact to avoid. But then you have supporting infrastructure. You have the things which crush your ore, for example. And so one way to avoid impact is, instead of having those outside your pit, you can have them actually inside the pit. This is what some of the world's biggest iron mines do now. And so you avoid that extra land use footprint of having your infrastructure outside. But that you still have a certain impact, and maybe you can then reduce that further. So maybe you can't avoid having a pit to get at the resource, but you can say, well, actually, you know, part of this the resource is underneath a highly threatened ecosystem, and we're not going to mine that part. You could minimize your impacts by excluding that part, or, you know, with your supporting infrastructure, instead of having lorries trucking your ore out, you could have a conveyor belt which is suspended above natural habitat, for example. These are the types of things you can do to avoid and minimize. It's not always feasible to completely avoid and reduce your impacts. So that's where we go on to the sort of the reactive and side of the hierarchy, which is, you know, restoring and then potentially compensating through offsetting, for example. So if you've used some land for, you know, in a logging concession, the places where you store the logs whilst you're harvesting an area, when you're done with that, you know, that area can be replanted and restored, for example. And compensation, always the last resort. And in general, there is a continuum here that the actions on the left, the preventive actions, are the most certain to be effective, and they are often the cheapest as well, especially over the long term. Whereas the further right you go, the actions are less certain in terms of outcomes, and often they're more expensive. It's more expensive to restore a natural habitat than to avoid impacting it in the first place, for example. But it's a useful framework for thinking, okay, you know, in terms of the actions we're doing, if we go back to Grant's previous slide, for example, if I'm, you know, trying to write terms into a loan agreement, or if I'm setting up my due diligence, you know, thinking through, okay, you what are the things that I'm going to ask the people I'm investing in to report about, on avoidance and minimization, for example. Yes, we have a question.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yeah, so just to remind you that we are already doing a lot of things that contribute to biodiversity work, and as Malcolm said, circular economy is a very important concept for that. This picture is from Sitra that has been working a lot with circularity during the recent years. So the circular economy is a business model or economical system where the aim is to close the loop. So use all the resources, materials, products as efficiently as possible. So reuse, repair, recycle as long as possible to avoid the need of using new resources. And circularity has links to nearly all of the nature loss drivers in many ways, so it decreases the pressure for nature in many ways. For example, of course, as I mentioned, it reduces the need for new resource extraction and land use, lessens habitat destruction, and by doing so, protects ecosystems and biodiversity. Of course, it further minimizes the amount of waste and pollution, and by so supports healthy ecosystems. It also contributes in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, which further, again, supports the nature. So the key takeaway here is that circular economy is very strongly linked with biodiversity and is one of the key concepts in safeguarding it. If you want to read more about interesting Finnish circular economy companies, Sitra has made a list of 41, I don't know why it's 41, not 40, but maybe there are 41 interesting circular economy companies in Finland. I would want to mention one example, Soil Food, a company founded 2015. And their business model is to sell side stream management services for industries, for example, pulp industry, bioenergy, food industry. So they're managing their side streams. And out of these side streams, they manufacture different types of products, such as soil improvers and fertilizers, which they then sell to agricultural purposes. So kind of a nice example of circular economy in practice. Then back at
thank you,
either
Inka.
of you.
So we want to hear from you again now. Thanks, Inka, Malcolm. So we got another Menti next. Oh, the clicker's not working. Excellent. So just, in terms of key takeaways from this section. So, analysis assessment needs to be designed to inform action, to reduce the risk posed to nature, risk posed to biodiversity, not an end in itself. Data relatively there, can be done. Yes, it is easier with private assets, but the landscape is changing very quickly. And there are various frameworks, evidence bases, examples, as you just heard from Inka and Malcolm, that can really inform and prioritize actions that contribute towards nature positive.